Welcome to another NASAGA podcast. My name is Sonya Wolfram.
And I'm Nick Wolfram.
And we're volunteer content creators for NASAGA, involved in the games community, as well as the local Seattle Serious and Social Impact Games meetup. We're here today to talk about empathy in games and explore how it manifests in them. So let's talk about empathy. Empathy has been in the basis for human interaction and cooperation since recorded history. And it seems very plausible that incorporating empathy into the design of a game is natural to most designers because it's so basic to us. I'm sure there is some common overlap among how designers incorporate empathy into their games. So Nick, what are some common methods in games to establish empathy for characters from players?
Empathy generally comes along naturally with strong character development. It's well known that it really starts with a name, but as far as designers are concerned, empathy starts with concepting. Humans have no trouble empathizing even with an inanimate object after even just the smallest impetus. After a name, it increases with the natural course of character development. The more desires, idiosyncrasies, and flaws we see in a character, the more inclined we are to empathize with them. This is exemplified whenever they face hardship and strife. Basically, these are the two factors that I believe are most essential for drawing out a sense of empathy from players. Relatable characters and relatable hardship. Even just one of these elements can be sufficient to trigger empathy from players. I also believe other factors, such as player choices, voice acting, music, and even visuals, can help reinforce and amplify these triggers, but relatable characters and/or hardships still need to be the foundation. For example, I actually thought the minor choices the player makes during the introductory segment of Firewatch that slightly alter the narrative did a great job of reinforcing the emotional impact of the whole sequence.
Yeah, I agree. We actually noticed some of the things later on in the story that had changed because of the way that we interacted with another character.
Yeah.
That was pretty cool. So do you feel like there are certain types of games are more likely to trigger empathy?
As far as genre goes, maybe. Obviously, character-driven games tend to be the best at triggering empathy. I'm not sure if the latest Madden or Forza game, no matter how good they may be, has ever triggered a deep sense of empathy in a player. There needs to be at least one character arc, some sense of progress and development. I also believe that pacing is extremely important. Players need time and mental space to reflect on and process their feelings. And that can't really happen without some sort of varying pace that includes a measure of downtime. Reaching a peaceful village, a low-impact cutscene, or even just a simplified section of exploration, all can give players time for reflection to kind of process their empathy. This allows them to relate their own real-life experiences to the experience of these characters, which is exactly what empathy is when you boil it down.
Are there any recent or historic games you feel do a particularly good job with empathy?
As far as recent games go, I'd actually probably say Nier Automata is the most recent game I've played that packed a surprisingly emotional experience for me. As a big fan of one of the design companies behind it, Platinum Games, I was expecting more of a character-driven action game, pretty straightforward, maybe some sassy commentary, but not much else. But I actually think it's a particularly poignant example of empathy, because not one of the characters is technically even human. With nothing but robotic characters, literally, some androids or gynoids and some are just strict robots, the game's director Yoko Taro managed to pack a strikingly impactful story and experience into the game, which, as I said, was very unexpected but extremely welcome. And I was otherwise expecting it to just be a fairly standard action game. Part of what made it so great was that it didn't even need this aspect to succeed. As most of Platinum's games, it was already a highly competent and engaging action game. However, the director managed to build upon this to make a much more fulfilling experience. Some other games that I feel do a great job of engaging the player empathically, both historically and recently, it would include Life is Strange, To the Moon, Firewatch, and Eco. However, as I played these games, I found myself willing to forgive many of the more apparent design flaws they had compared to Nier Automata. Not that Nier Automata wasn't without flaws, but it, along with maybe Eco and Firewatch, is the only one of these games that I would likely still be happy to play, even if it didn't offer an engaging emotional experience on top of its core gameplay appeal. And honestly, that is one of the advantages of crafting an empathic experience in your game. Players will be more likely to forgive other flaws present into the design, allowing you a little more leeway.
And when you say Eco, you mean ICO and not ECO.
Yeah, the predecessor to Shadow of the Colossus from director Fumito Ueda.
Yep. So do you feel like more games should focus on empathy a little bit more than they currently do, or is it more that there should be a time and a place for empathy?
I mean, empathy is part of the player experience. If designers want that to be part of their experience, they just need to be mindful of the factors that contribute to that goal. I think it is a perfectly respectable goal for the designers to aim for, but I don't think it's necessary for every game. Forcing it into a game where it doesn't really fit is probably more likely to make the player feel awkward than actually empathize with the game's characters.
Yeah, that makes sense. It would be kind of forced at that point. So let's shift a little bit toward designing empathy into games. If you were to create a game from scratch, knowing you wanted empathy to be a major presence in it, how would you do it?
As I mentioned earlier, it starts in the concepting phase. I actually think Life is Strange is a great example of this. If you haven't had a chance to look at the concept art for this game, I highly recommend everybody do it if you're a fan or otherwise. Particularly, I've seen a large number of players who relate to Chloe Price, the protagonist's best friend in the game. Just by looking at her design, you can feel like you know a lot about her. She has blue hair, she wears casual, loose-fitting clothes, she has a tattoo on her arm, she has a sense of rebellion to her without it being over the top. And all of this in an 18-year-old girl. In short, she looks like a real person that the players could easily know in their own lives. On top of that, the story of the game shows she is a teenager who has a troubled home life and makes some poor decisions as a result of this. This is a very realistic and highly relatable scenario for someone to go through, and that, along with her in-game troubles, are why her design resonated so well with players. I'd also like to add something I have yet to touch upon. The aesthetic flourishes, which I guess I briefly mentioned it. Music, voice acting, and sound design can actually make a tremendous impact on a player's emotional state. Just the right song playing at the right time can really drive home the mood of a scene and really help the player connect and remember that scene. Life is Strange is a great example of this, for example. However, I don't think this impact is enough to make the experience empathic on its own. But they can do a fantastic job of reinforcing the impact of other factors.
Right, so it's more like it's supporting the fact that the empathy should already be there.
Exactly.
Yeah. So would you make the player aware that they either need empathy or recognize that they need empathy for them to be successful in the game?
Frankly, no. Lampshading a need for empathy will almost definitely be disruptive to the experience and actually counterintuitive to the goal. You don't want to tell players what to feel. As with most aspects of design, it is better to guide the player through subtlety without being explicit about your intentions. You know, if as soon as you say it out loud, it kind of makes the player almost not want to follow through with that.
Yeah. Don't tell me how to feel right now.
Exactly. Like, nobody wants to be told how to feel.
Yeah.
And plus, if the player isn't inclined to feel empathy, you're basically telling them, hey, you're probably not going to have a good time here.
Yeah. So that kind of segues into an interesting topic. So when writing or designing a game with empathy for other people who are listening to this, do you feel like there are some best practices to consider or things not to do, like one of the things we just mentioned?
I mean, I feel like we've covered at least some of the best practices. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about what not to do. I've spoken a lot about incorporating flaws into characters, but a lot of characters we see have flaws that are just one-note caricatures of flaws. These characters often fall into molds of easily defined archetypes. The short-tempered strongman, the poor cook, who may even be a great magic user, the klutz who bumbles into success. These are flaws, but they're one-dimensional and unrelatable. It's just too easy to define them in like a few words or less. Good flaws take nuance and a careful attention to detail. As you design your characters, try to defy cliches. Design beyond standard archetypes. Nothing can trump originality.
So would you say something like Chloe in Life is Strange, you see many scenarios where her flaws are kind of incorporated in different ways. She keeps making the wrong decisions, but it's a different decision every time, right? And that kind of puts her in trouble most of the time.
Yeah, it's hard to define her flaws quickly. She's a complex character.
Yeah. So the more complex, the more nuanced the flaws are.
Yeah, whereas like Barrett from Final Fantasy VII, as much as I love him nostalgically, he's got a short temper and a heart of gold, and that kind of sums him up. He's a big, strong, gruff guy.
Yeah. Cool. So, any examples where a game does a poor job of incorporating empathy into the gameplay, so we can kind of give the listeners some examples. So, what happened in those examples, and how could they have done better?
Honestly, I don't know if there need to be examples, because a poor sense of empathy is kind of the standard for most games. It's the baseline. Especially in classic games, where characters are nameless avatars of destruction for the player. I mean, obviously not all classic games, but many classic games, many platformers, your character might as well not have a name, and it's usually like a little bit of trivia that someone has if they even know their character's name.
Mm-hmm.
They are just an empty vessel through which the player progresses through the game and defeats the final boss. The simple fact is, many designers, I'm not going to say most, but many designers don't care about constructing an emotionally resonant experience beyond being fun or I mean, actually, that's probably it, just being fun. And that's fine, honestly. It doesn't necessarily need to be emotionally resonant beyond that. Games are fun. Not every game needs to be focused on empathy and emotional experiences. Many of them just want to be strictly fun and memorable, and that's where games started. It will be a part of their future, and there's nothing wrong with a designer making that their goal. If they want to go beyond that, great. If they don't, I don't see any reason to leverage that as a criticism.
Cool. So, lastly, if you had one piece of advice for a game developer making a game with empathy, what would it be?
Focus on character design, both in terms of visuals and story. Make fully realized characters with flaws that your players can relate to. Don't be afraid to put them into realistically difficult situations that players can relate to. Having to fight off a massive dinosaur armored with cannons may make for an exciting hurdle for players, but it's not relatable. If that dinosaur intentionally destroyed the protagonist's only record of his wife's final moments shortly before he could see it for the first time, then the player now has something to relate to. This not only adds weight to the battle and instills the player determination, but the player can now empathize better with the plight of the protagonist. Even though you're fighting this armored dinosaur and it's a completely ridiculous situation, it's still something that you can relate to. Even the most ridiculous of situations can be relatable with the right context.
Awesome. Well, if that's it, then we have finalized another podcast for NASAGA. If you can check us out on social media and follow us, that would be great. And we will see you next time. Thanks.
Yeah, it's been great talking with you.